our guest speaker, the Victoria Scott Miller. I want her to just tell you some of the things that she is the first of in North Carolina, or just ever, because she's had so many firsts that, you know how sometimes it's like, are black people still having firsts? Yes, they are still having firsts. And I think that that's one of the things where you have to be a trailblazer, and that means that sometimes you don't conform, and sometimes you do things you don't necessarily want to do to get to being the first of something.
Good morning. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my medicine on stage. I'm going to do that. I'm going to take my medicine first. I was going to take my medicine before, but I said it's important for us to see people taking care of their bodies, right? So I wanted to do that.
Okay, we're here for the story. We are here. We are listening. We are 100% listening.
Right here.
Okay.
Okay, now we're good to go.
Okay.
Okay. The first. Wow. Even when I say it aloud or when people read my bio, I'm often shrinking myself. I'm kind of going back in the corner because it's really difficult for me to talk about myself all the time. But I'll lead with I am the first Black woman contractor at the North Carolina Museum of Art in their history. And I created a series called The Museum Lives in Me, which is a book that explores Blackness within the museum. So I'm the first to do that. I am the first Black woman and youngest African American to be inducted into the Wake County Public School Hall of Fame in the category of entrepreneurship.
Don't say what happened.
I am the first, I opened up the first Black-owned children's bookstore in the state of North Carolina, This seems so boastful. I know, but this is a part of the process, right? I am sitting alongside, have the honor of sitting alongside next month with Justice Ketanji Brown. We'll be on a panel at the Atlantic Festival. I've been featured in Essence and NPR and Black Enterprise and CNN and BET and all the things. But I've done a lot of trailblazing. I've done a lot of firsts. But I want to put a disclaimer: is that I've done a lot of firsts being unwell. So realizing the burnout of the success, of the first, of the global recognition, and wanting to make sure that, you know, I'm well in the process, yeah.
Yes, now, this is gonna go slightly a little bit darker, but, and I'm gonna tell you why, because we need to get the darkness out so we can bring the light today. So, have you ever had to close your business? Raise your hand if you ever had to close your business. But can you tell them why you closed yours? And then we'll transition out of that.
All right. So I opened the bookstore. Actually, the bookstore was online. Originally, we were a pop-up from 2019 until 2023. We were able to welcome over 4,000 people into the city of Raleigh with, you know, global coverage last Juneteenth. And then we began receiving death threats. And I took a moment to assess our capacity and whether or not being at the forefront of the movement of literacy and representation should be something that a family should do, or that we should maybe go back to the drawing board to think about how to do it collectively with our community. And so we decided to close our location in April due to death threats that were happening with our children And we just felt that it would be reckless to kind of continue putting ourselves in the face of that adversity until we were able to assess where the danger was. So we ended up closing that location.
Now, with that, and I want you guys to understand something because LaShawn Harley that's over there, we had a conversation about grieving. And how many of you have had, and it could just be this year or you could say in general, but let's just say even in the last calendar year or maybe even in the last 3 years, how many of you had somebody pass away? Okay. Feels like, right? But we don't necessarily think about a business and think about grieving business, right? Like we think about, just people passing. But what is that transition of you saying, okay, well this is over, but I still can do other things. And I can see that there is a light for me to be able to continue because I'm not gonna let that stop me.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful question because like you said, we don't think about grief. When I think about, as a woman, as a mother, I've had a miscarriage before, and I liken my experience to a miscarriage, right? Primarily because when you are grieving anything, it doesn't take away from the fact that it existed, which I think is powerful. And so when I think about my business closing, I think about this particular dream that I wanted to be sustainable, that I wanted to be healthy, that I had dreams for it, hopes for it, but it just did not have the right conditions in order to thrive. And so as you are grieving a loss, I think storytelling and memory is an important part of that process, because even though the physical aspect of the store or the dream or the experience is not available, you're still able to remember it, right? And that's still calling and manifesting it into existence in other ways, which is what ends up happening. So, yeah.
So, what happens after, right? So, the store's closed.
Yeah.
But, tell them about some of the other wonderful things, because one of the things that I would say that I think we have to take into consideration is it's a reason that something stopped.
Yeah.
And some things, you might not have wanted them to stop when they stop, but there should be something that really comes out of it that's wonderful after that. So can you give them some of that?
Yeah, so shortly after the bookstore closed, we went into, my family, my husband, our children went into a period of rest. And that was the most difficult thing to do because I think as Black folks, as Black women, we normally just connect ourselves to the next thing, right? We're assigning ourselves to things. And I realized that was a part of my process to make me feel whole, was to continue doing that. But shortly after I closed the bookstore, I ended up selling my documentary to Disney.
Hold on, y'all. See, y'all didn't know that, though, right? Yeah, they can't bring it down. You think I'm talking about?
I ended up signing a global multi-book deal for the museum lives in me. So now I don't just do one museum, I do museums all across the world. And like I said about wellness, right? I knew that I had anxiety, right? I knew that it was kind of difficult for me. So I will say, when the death threat started, I was diagnosed with high blood pressure. And, that's often like our people's demise, right? Like it's something that we neglect, that elevated blood pressure we think is circumstantial, but for me it was chronic. And that was one of the first pills that I took when I was up here. And shortly after the bookstore closed and I made a deliberate choice to not assign myself to anything, my anxiety came, but then I was diagnosed with depression. And I realized through my diagnosis with depression that I had been operating from what I thought was a holistic, creative place. But really, I was still in survival mode. I was in survival mode, my body was in fight or flight, and I'm looking at my life and I'm saying, well, how was I able to do all of these incredible things, right? To the point where when I'm going into these places and you're reading my bio, I'm looking around saying, who are you talking about? Where is she, right? Because I'm not connected to the experience, because it's what I do for survival. It's not what I do to make myself feel alive, right? And so, looking on the other side of the bookstore closing, I think, well, if I was able to do that unwell, then what am I able to do well? What am I able to do well? Like, I have a point of reference. So I can go and look at my resume and say, look what you did while you were sick, Victoria. But then it gives me hope to say, wow, I can really dream so much bigger. I really am limitless to create and to be. And I think that's the freedom in grief. I think, I forgot the pastor's name. I was listening to it, but he said, pain doesn't have the authority to destroy you. It only has the authority to make you. And so when I think about the concept of pain, when I think about the concept of grief, it doesn't have the authority. It isn't given the authority to break me down and to make me incapable of doing something, right? But it does have the authority to teach me. And we have to make a conscious decision as to whether or not we want to be students, right? We can always reject the lesson. We can always choose to reject the lesson. But submitting to the discomfort of being a student, I think has brought so much more power to my life, to my purpose, and to some of the things that are happening right now. So it's been good.
Yes. Now, what would you say to people who need intervention? So when we talk about mental health, right?
Yes.
We talk about recognizing that something is wrong and then taking the step to actually fix.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not a complete fix,
Sure.
but to maybe alleviate some of the stress, some of the pressure. What would you say to people who need that intervention? And maybe they recognize it,
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily doing anything about it.
I would say prepare for it the same way you do for a hurricane, right? So when you're looking at the weather, the meteorologist is like, hey, it's going to be a tropical storm, like things are going to be shut down, going to be flooding happening. What do? You automatically go to the store and you start like stocking up on things, right? But understanding that that is just a prediction of things to come. It doesn't mean that it's going to come, but the conditions are happening in such a way that it's kind of creating the condition for the possibility, right? So when I think about mental health, when I think about wellness, I think about preparing for the possibility of the right set of conditions causing your breaking season and just having it available to you. So making sure that you are assessing your support system, right? Who can I realized in the midst of my depression and anxiety, I had an arsenal of masks, right? I had a beautiful collection of masks. And depending on where I had to go, I would say, oh, this mask fits this particular situation. I'm a black woman going into a white space. Let me articulate my words. Let me sit up straight. I'm a black woman going into black spaces. Let me try to like fit in and be cool. Like let me, shrink parts of myself. And so I think when I think about my mental health, I think about what is in my storehouse that allows me to be prepared for the possibility of my breaking. A morbid approach, I think it's a preventative measure that we have not been taught to do because we're often taught not to rest. We equate rest to laziness often, but rest in itself is our birthright. It is not a luxury, it is a requirement. We are not a machine, and I think that's what I had to realize is that I am not a machine. Like, right when we met, I was doing a presentation about my experience at the North Carolina Museum of Art, and the North Carolina Museum of Art very, very privately made an attempt to, I procured over a $400,000 grant. I had written a grant to develop the first artist residency there, the first writer residency there, and I appointed Black people for those positions. And after that money had been procured, I was released. And they kept the money, and they tried to take away the book that I had created, right? But the possibility, my preparation was that, hey, something doesn't feel right. How do I protect myself? I got a lawyer. And I ended up securing and trademarking before the conditions even arise, right? Like I realized that it was me, the Black woman, the only Black woman in their history. So if I'm the only Black woman in this position and we're talking about this being 2020, then you've done a lot of things to prevent other Black folks from attaining this opportunity. So what other things have you swept under the rug? What other things weren't Black folks able to advocate for? So I protected myself, and in doing that, I was able to sign a global book deal because it was mine. It was something that I kept. A lot of things we have to realize that the institution, I think Trishy Hersey or something, I forgot her name, but she said that, yeah, she said the institution does not love us, right? So sometimes we go into these spaces, and my husband was very like opposed to me going into this space, this institution, and giving my all. I was excited, right? I'm collaborative naturally. There hadn't been Black folks in this space. I was excited about bringing Black people into art spaces, and I was giving my all. And he said, you went in there and you reserved nothing for yourself. You kept nothing for yourself. You want to give them all of your ideas. And so we had a lot of back and forth about that. But what I realized in that moment is that he was saying, like, you got to save some for yourself, you know? And in doing that, I was able to protect myself. I was able to heal from that experience. And yeah, so it's been, yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Because you transition into where I want to go to when we talk about opportunities. And so I am a big proponent for doing a SWOT analysis on a regular basis, which, if you don't know, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I always tell people that there are more opportunities out there, but they have to pay attention. They have to be in certain rooms, but they also have to make space for themselves. And so can you talk about you being able to make space for yourself in places where maybe, we weren't seen, but then also transition that to something where it was beneficial to you? Because I think sometimes when we get into these spaces, we do want to give our all. And then when we realize that people will replace you very quickly, or when we realize that people will disrespect you, or they don't want to pay you what you want, those are some of the things where it's like, you realize, well, I spent a couple of years doing X, Y, Z, and you really don't value, what I bring. And I think that I always try to put myself in positions where people do value what you bring, and when they value what you bring, they treat you differently. So can you speak to people kind of creating their own opportunities and just being able to just grow from that?
So I think that when you first enter a room, what I often do, I go into a room and the first thing I say is, who am I in this room for? Right? Like I realize that we have a responsibility that when we are able to access spaces of power, that we have to not be in that room for only ourselves. We have to be able to go in and say, what woman is going to take this position? What man is going to, what child is going to be in this position? And how am I able to make room for them? But then also too, assessing who's not in the room, right? A lot of these places that I've gone into, their board does not reflect me. The art on the wall does not reflect me. When I'm interviewing with CNN or the Washington Post or the New York Times, and they're trying to curate a story about me being, a single woman with 2 children and not wanting to put my husband alongside.
I'm like
my whole family, right? Like I have a whole husband 16 years in. My thing is, people will try to craft a narrative that fits their version of you, because anything outside of that is just difficult, right? It's difficult to conceive. And so I think what we have to do is to not go into a situation, don't allow your endeavor, don't allow the adventure of your exploration to be about trying to prove somebody wrong, right? Because that takes a lot of energy. I think the objective is to go in selflessly, right? And realize that, like, I did not make it to the room because of myself, right? There was someone else that wasn't heard, that wasn't seen, that was devalued before I got into this place. And it's my responsibility to not only live for them, but also to live for the next person. And I think that we have to have more, there has to be more reverence around our agency, right? Like, we are the culture. Like, Black clothes are the culture, right? Like, we create so much. And I think that, unfortunately, I'm 38 now, but unfortunately what social media does is it creates these sound bites of information that make us feel like devalued, right? They make us feel devalued, these little snippets about, who's attaining this and what's happening here. It's like, no, people actually had to work. You can't compare somebody's like snippet to the 10-year thing, right? So I think we have to ensure that we like pull away to not allow ourselves to get discouraged because there's so much work to do. There's so much work that needs to be done in so many areas, and it's vast, and everybody should be like, it should be all hands on deck right now, because I think that we forget that there's an urgency. There's an urgency happening right now, and I'm not just talking about voting, I'm talking about with our bodies, with our minds, with our access to healthcare. Like, it's so much happening right now, and this country, we forget, was actually built on entrepreneurship. Like, it was built on entrepreneurship. We should be creating the thing that we need for our communities, and we should be doing that collectively. So I think that's the best way to, I hope I answered your question. I feel like
I want to just ask, kind of like one final kind of wrap-up question that makes sense for what we do and what our goal is with the community, right? So for my thing with this, we wanted this particular event to be something that is not just here in Durham, not just here in the Triangle, but something that is impactful in the state of North Carolina. And so just like people, and I always say, if you saw the video ahead of time, jump all the way over west and go to Atlanta, they got enough people in Atlanta, okay? All right, so we need some things to be here, all right? And the same way as sometimes we jump over this area and go to Charlotte, right? So when we talk about making an economic impact, the thing that a lot of businesses need and maybe don't get the way that they should is capital, but also sponsorship, right? And so, not just capital as far as a loan, which that's good, of course, if you need that too, but there are companies out here that can sponsor some of the things. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think we have to think about ourselves as an asset, right? Like go into a room and go into a sponsor and say, like, you are the best thing, right? I think we have to get really creative about how we access capital. For example, a lot of folks don't, to be able to, I don't know, if you're creating an educational service, right? Partnering with universities, partnering with people that have like initiatives, and actually like going down the pipeline to see like who can I connect with that will allow me to access capital. But then also figuring out like what your community needs, I think is really important, because sometimes we have lofty goals that don't necessarily resonate with like what people need in this moment. And I think assessing that and partnering with different organizations, I think has been like powerful at this point. We relied on our community. We had a pop-up model originally and an online model, and my husband and I were just like, we don't want to ask the community for any funding until we are able to offer them a physical space. So we didn't ask for anything. There was no GoFundMe, there was nothing until we knew that we would have a physical space for people able to come in. And our community resonated with that because we had gone 6 years without asking for funding. 6 years just like hitting the ground running, and a lot of folks don't know that, and this might be a little off topic, but just a little bit about our background. My mother had inherited the papers. When you talk about wealth, my mom had inherited a conversation of handwritten letters between Nathaniel Knight, who was a white bookstore owner, not became a bookstore owner, a white bookstore owner and Justice of the Peace in Fells Point, Baltimore, and Frederick Douglass. So we had grown up seeing those papers in like these Ziploc bags all of our life. And right before we started Liberation Station, we had been offered over $2 million for those papers. And we declined. And we declined at a time where my husband was coming from the military. He was a nuclear engineer on a submarine, but was unemployed because he was a smart black man. And we were on food stamps. And like to decline $2 million for the greater good of understanding like your value, I think that taught us so much. It taught us so much about what it meant to say no, what it meant to create an offering for your community. And I think that it's important to be intentional with the ask, right? Like be intentional with what you need and have a guideline for that will be sustainable. I always say, think 300 years in the future, right? Think 300 to 400 years in the future. And part of our success was thinking about the time that we would not be able to be here and thinking about what the impact would still be with us not around. So I think that's important.
Oh my goodness. So that's how you know what love is? Okay, so I just wanted to leave enough time though. If someone has a question, now let me explain the rules and regulations amongst ourselves. Ask your question. We're not advertising your business, okay? And your question cannot be 5 minutes either. So a quick question, so we can take some questions really quickly. If you have a question, feel free to come up so we can hear you on the mic because we are recording. So does anybody, okay, come on up.
So I just understand, I want to step back to the Liberation Station and the children's books and just acknowledging how hard it is to find those books. I wanted to know if you had curated a list that you share and then just trying to figure out exactly how you're working through the process to make sure that the authors and the illustrators are
Excellent question.
Yeah, so from the beginning, my family and I, so it's my husband, Dwayne, our oldest son, who is Langston, and our youngest son, Emerson. We had always had access to like books growing up. We're originally from Memphis, Tennessee, so it was Black everything. But I think part of our curation process is to read every book before we put it on the shelf. Because we have 4 different vantage points in our home that we're able to contribute to. So that's part of our curation process, is that we read every book before we put it on the shelf. We talk to every author before we interact, just to make sure it's in alignment with our values and our goals. And we do have a website. So if you go to liberationstation.com, we have a curated list, but we're not just looking at the Black experience. We actually follow the transatlantic voyage. So you will have African writers there as well, and Brazilian writers and everyone. So yeah, that answers your question.
Excellent. Okay, another question? This is a speed now, or hold on to it? Okay.
Would like to know, you being so successful, what was the event or moment when you realized, like, I am not healthy? Like, you know, life starts life, but sometimes we just keep going. What was your, like, aha moment? Yeah. And then it really resonated with me when you said I had to rest, because that's kind of like, I've been in a season of rest. And then how did you deal with the guilt of rest?
So, interestingly enough, I want to talk about the rest part, and then I'll talk about how I arrived to that, right? I want to shout out the Village of Wisdom, if y'all are familiar with that organization here in Durham. So, this was a year, maybe last year, they had a fellowship opportunity that you could apply for, and I applied really because of curiosity. You know, this was an organization that specifically focused on like Black parents and Black folks, and I was just like, I've never seen anything like that, and I applied for the fellowship really out of curiosity, and it came with a stipend. So I'm a part of this fellowship for the next 3 years, and it comes with a $1,000 stipend. 500 of that has to be spent on rest. It's required. They just did a retreat this past weekend where we were at Moorhead Manor and we were resting. We were taking naps. We were getting massages. And it seems almost utopian. But I realized that if you're doing like this liberation work, you're trying to free people, right? You actually have to be well rested. And I don't just mean like sleep, like your mind has to have like a pause for a second. And so through that organization, I've realized how important and how impactful it is for resting. And you asked about the moment that happened. I was sitting in the bathroom, this was 20 days ago. So I've been on Zoloft for 23 days actually. And they ran my tests and all that, they, did the scans, and I realized that I had low serotonin levels, which is responsible for mood, regulation, decision making, all types of things. And I always wondered, I never felt like I was a sad person or anything like that, but I was always social. So my active social life often masked my sadness, and then I'm a mom, and then I'm a wife. And so I never really had the opportunity to break, because I was always into something, right? Like I just named off like things that I've done in a year. Like I opened up the bookstore, I signed a global book deal, I signed with, Disney, and all these things. I have an agent, and I'm, doing like this all is happening like within a year. And I'm also like on CNN and all these other things. And I'm just like, I'm just going in a circle, going in a cycle. And the bookstore closed in April, and I had stopped showering, and I had stopped brushing my teeth, and I didn't even realize what it was, because through my public declaration that we were resting, I couldn't assign myself into anything. So I'd actually cornered myself. I had cornered myself to break, because the public declaration was that Liberation Station has had this experience. We're now going into a period of rest. Basically, don't contact us, right? And so in that resting, I was like, well, I've said that to, the 23,000 followers. I've said that to the global community. So I can't go just back out into the world and start doing things. So I actually had to sit with myself. I had to sit with myself. And I remember one day we have a porch garden. So my husband, he is a physicist by trade, and he like mixes cucumbers and watermelons. And we have like cucumbers and watermelon growing out in the garden. And I'm sitting in the garden on the concrete, and I'm just crying. And I'm crying profusely in a way where I'm wailing. And my children are on the inside, and I'm like, I'm not well. Like I'm just not like well. Like I'm not crying for any particular reason. I am trying to figure out like what is it about me that's breaking. There was nothing I could do, and then my husband ended up, calling. Like I was in a crisis. And I remember I took my first pill, and I was so against medicine, right? I'm always like, let's do the holistic approach. Let me do some yoga, let me do some aromatherapy. And I'm just like, none of this is working, right? Like even I even had to wrestle with my relationship with God, because I was like, God, like you created me this way, like, and I'm successful, and I'm opposed to like, Victoria can't have like depression. Victoria can't have severe depression. I've had anxiety, of course, everybody got anxiety, but Victoria Scott Miller cannot have depression. That's impossible. And he brought me all the way down to my knees. He said, you do, and I'm gonna teach you how to be successful with it. And it was the most powerful experience to submit to something that I could not fix. And I had absolutely no control over it, And that's part of our process. It's like, we have to break, right? There is going to be a season for breaking. But the beautiful thing about breaking is that, like, you come back almost unrecognizable to yourself. She's about to make me cry. I want to show y'all. And I don't have a big screen or anything like that, but I want to show y'all a picture the day before, the day of my breaking. The day of my breaking, you actually can see it on my Instagram page. When I broke, I went and I got my hair flat ironed, and I went and bought this beautiful shade of red lipstick, and I put on a cute dress, and I went and took a picture. Right? And I said, this will make me feel better. And I posted about it, another mask. But I looked in my eyes, right? In my eyes, I saw sorrow. In my eyes, I saw grief. In my eyes, I saw me being unwell. And then I was on the medication for, 3 days. And then my eyes were open, full of light for the first time. And I became recognizable to myself. And so, as difficult as it was, I am so grateful for breaking. I am so grateful that I submitted to the things that I don't have control over, because it has brought me a peace that you cannot purchase. It's a peace that you cannot attain on your own. So I was grateful for that. So I appreciate your question, and I would love to show you, like I really want to show you the picture before, because you can just see, you know, you can see. But I think life is worth exploring, having a before and after picture. Ooh. I think life is worth exploring that. This is the last year of my 30s, right? I'll be 40 next year. And I'm just like, thank you, God, for breaking me. Thank you. I'm so grateful. You know, because I would not have been able to, I would have thought that my survival method was like, yeah, that's successful. But it's not. I deserve rest. I deserve peace. You know, I deserve access to good health care. You know, and I deserve to break. I do. So
I need y'all to give it up for Victoria Scott. Do you see why I told you we needed to start this? When we're talking about mental wealth and Black entrepreneurship, I don't know if what you thought you were going to get, but did you get what we gave? You got what we gave? Okay.